This lesson is validating data. The objectives for this lesson are to add validation data annotations to our product class. We're going to create a validation helper class that will help us with the validation itself. And then we're going to modify the insert and the update methods to call the validation of the data. Data annotations are simply attributes that are added to properties to enforce business rules. And you'll find that Microsoft has given us the most common business rule attributes, such as required, compare, you want to compare one property against another, range, min length, max length, string length, email, URL, phone, credit card, and there's a lot of other ones that you can find at this link right here. Let's add some more data annotations to our product class. Open the product.cs file underneath the entity layer folder and come down to where you find the public string name. And I'm going to add a new attribute called StringLength. The first parameter is 50, which means that's the maximum size. But we also had the ability to set a minimum length property if we want to require the user enters a minimum number of characters. So I've set it to 4. Now, what I had done before is I'd already previously added some required attributes. So this means that the user must absolutely fill in that product name. Otherwise, they will get an error thrown back to them once we do the validation. Let's go to the product number and let's also add the string length. But this one, we're going to do a maximum length of 25 and a minimum length of 3. So we can do this for whatever we want. For example, like if we come down here to the standard cost, we can say we want the range to be 0.01 cents to $9,999. We can do the same thing with the list price. So we're using just a few of these just so you get the idea. Then let's come down here to the cell start date and let's do a range. Now with the range, if it's not numeric, you need to pass the first parameter there, which is the type of. So this time we're doing a type of the date time, and then we're telling it the range that we want to be. We want to go from 1/1/2020 to 12/31/2030. So the user must pass in a cell start date that is within that range. Otherwise, again, a validation exception will be thrown, and we can then report that data back to the caller. Now that we've added our data annotations, how do we do the validation in our minimal web API projects? Because unlike MVC, there is no automatic model binding. There's no automatic validation. So that means we need to write the code ourselves. Well, not to worry, because we're still going to use the data annotations for validation, and we're going to use a little helper method to actually perform the validation just like Microsoft does within MVC. If you want more information on this, check out my article in Code Magazine on data annotations. I describe in detail how this method works, talk about creating your own custom attributes as well. Let's take a look at adding our own validation helper class. This will be a nice generic method that we can call from anywhere. Right mouse click on your project and let's add a new folder called Validation Classes. Then let's right mouse click on that folder and add a new class called Validation Helper. Now into this Validation Helper class is where we're going to create a nice little method that will perform the validation of all the data annotations for us. So this is pretty standard code where I'm just going to be using the system.componentmodel.data annotations. I'm putting it under the namespace, AdventureWorks API, validation classes. Then we have a class here called Validation Helper. It's a static class because I simply have a single static method called validate. This validate method, you pass in some sort of entity like a product or a customer, and it's going to return to you a dictionary, which is a standard dictionary object that you would find like in MVC. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that what gets passed in is not equal to null. We want to make sure we are going to be validating something, not a null. We're then on line 13 going to create a validation context to which we pass to the constructor the entity itself, not having any sort of service provider or other items that we're passing in. And then we have this list of validation result called results that I'm creating a new instance of. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this validator class that has this static method called try validate object. passing in the entity, passing in our validation context variable, and the results. What's going to happen is that result, it's going to fill it up with a list of validation result objects if any one of the data annotations fails. So once we have that, now you could, if you wanted to, just simply pass back that list of validation results. I want to convert it to a regular dictionary because this is the kind that is used by Microsoft everywhere. So I wanted to make sure that we put it into a known dictionary object. So I simply iterate over the results, and through each one, I grab the property name, and then I create this new dictionary object by doing ret.add, passing in the property name, a new string array with the error message, or if the error message is blank, I'm just going to put in unknown validation error. So the return value then is that dictionary of a string and a string array. Don't worry too much if you don't understand everything that I went through there. This is kind of a black box method. You don't really need to know about it and how it works in great detail, although you can check out my article if you are interested. But when you make that call, what we want to do is pass back a Results.ValidationProblem. This is a special version of a 400 bad request. It passes it back as a standard JSON object for validation errors, because that dictionary gets then put into the errors property that you see here with the property name and then the string array. And it'll have a series of these. There'll be as many as we have errors, validation errors, in our object. So let's go ahead and take a look. Let's modify the insert method to validate the entity. Open the productrouter.cs file located under the router classes folder and scroll down till you find the insert method. Just after the serialized entity, declare a new dictionary object that matches the return value that we just talked about. And I'm going to name it messages. So now what I want to do is, before I attempt to update the database, I'm going to actually add a little bit of code here where I'm going to do messages equals validation helper.validate, passing in that entity. Now, you can either put this here, but you don't have to. It can infer the type just by doing that. So either way is correct. Then I'm going to check to see if the messages is equal to null or the messages.count is equal to 0. If either one, then we're good. Everything passed the validation. We can go ahead and do the insert. But what happens if it fails this? So that means that some of the data validations were not correct. Well, in that case, in the else here, I want to build a Results.ValidationProblem passing in messages. So the validation problem, it's expecting a dictionary of the type string, comma, string array. So now you see why I built that dictionary object the way I did in the validation helper, because it has to do with the way that error messages like this, validation messages, are returned in JSON. Now that we've written this code, let's go ahead and run our application. We'll scroll down to our post method, click on try it out, and I'm going to change the request body here. I'm going to put in a name that only has a single character followed by a space. I'm going to put a product number in that's N1. I'm going to put in a list price of 0 and a standard cost of 0. So that's going to fail a few of our data annotations that we put in. Let's go ahead and execute this. And we should see immediately that we get our 400 bad request, but it's a special type of bad request because you can see now the errors. And you see that we've got the name. The field name must be a string with a minimum length of 4 and a maximum length of 50. That's the default message that's returned from that string length attribute that we added. You still see the same thing for the product number. That field product number must be a string with a minimum length. You see the standard cost and the list price. And the cell start date I had put in as something that was not between 1/1/2020 and 12/31/2030. Thus, there we have our failure of our data annotations. Let's go ahead and finish this up and modify the update method to do that same validation. Scroll down in your product router class and locate the update method. Just below the serialized entity in this method, add that same declaration for a dictionary object. And then let's add the same code right before we're ready to do the update. Let's go ahead and put that code in where it calls the validation helper.validate, passing in the entity, and then checks the messages coming back. If there aren't any, that means everything was successful. We can go ahead and perform our update. But if not, then what we need to do is add that else statement in where we're going to return the Results.ValidationProblem passing our dictionary object. Again, I'll leave it to you to go ahead and run this, put in some invalid data, and you'll see the same results that you saw when we ran the insert. In this lesson, we added a validation helper class and a validate method. This is just a generic method that we can call from anywhere. We then added some additional data annotations to our product class, and then we learned to call that validate method to validate those properties using our data annotations. Coming up next, create searching methods.